Okay, everyone, we're going to get things started. My name's Kylie, and I just want to start off with a land acknowledgement before we get into things. So I'm from Calgary, Alberta, which is Treaty 7 land. Everyone's land acknowledgement might be a bit different, but for Treaty 7, we want to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples of the Treaty 7 region and Métis Nation of Alberta, which is Region 3. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our community. So if you want to take a moment, you're welcome to put in the chat where you're from, and just sort of acknowledge that we're all kind of in a bit of a different space and sometimes even a bit of a different time. So for today, we have Megan, with the help of Viev and Cheryl, talking about what is the insight approach. So I will let them take it away. Please keep yourself muted unless you're talking, and feel free to use the chat for any questions.
All right. Thank you, Kylie. Really appreciate that and appreciate the acknowledgement of the land. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share so we can all see each other. We know we are here for just a sec. What is the insight approach? And so to get into that, I have to close that. I wanted to first introduce myself. My name is Megan Price, and I'm one of the I'm part of the steering committee, one of the founders of Insight Collaborations International, which is hosting this event. Really what EC is a collaboration of people working together around insight, applying insight, thinking about insight, pushing its bounds so that it can grow and we can leverage it to really understand and change the problems, the challenges that matter to us. So I'm Megan, and Cheryl Picard is here with me, and also Viev Price too. So we're going to be hosting this What is the Insight Approach? And so when we were putting together our programming for the year, we really wanted to offer this session for people who have heard about the Insight Approach, were intrigued by the Insight Approach, but didn't really know what it was. So we wanted to give kind of an overview of what is this thing that has motivated the three of us and all the people who are, part of the Insight Collaborations International, to really use it and commit to it in our work. What is the Insight Approach? What are we doing with it? How does it make a difference? What makes it unique? All of those things. So I'm really grateful to all of you who are here. Thank you. Yes, Upasana is here from India, which is amazing. We have people from all over, students from Royal Roads, professors from the Carter School at George Mason. I think we have some folks from San Egidio. Right, it's just really wonderful to be here together. So thank you. Yeah. Cheryl or Viev, did you want to introduce yourselves really quickly, and then I'll kind of launch into what is the Insight Approach?
Thank you, Megan. So I'm Cheryl Picard, and I was one of the early founders of Insight Mediation, and I'm going to talk a bit about, not so much about Insight Mediation, but where Insight Mediation emerged from and the questions that we were asking ourselves when we constructed this thing called Insight Mediation. Today, it seems like it just makes sense that it is what it is, but in the earlier days, not so much. And I'm excited by the interest that people have to join us here tonight, and I'm just excited to get going. Thanks.
And I'm Viev Rada Price, and I too am very just thrilled and happy to see all these mostly names on the screen, and that we're all sharing this hour together to talk and really have a conversation about what is the Insight Approach, and thrilled to be joining Megan and Cheryl, who both in their rights are quite the experts in this. So it's it's just a cool hour to have. So I'm very looking forward to it.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. So what is the insight approach? That is our big question. And rather than just, giving you a definition, I thought I like to get at this question through my own history a little bit. So I came to the insight approach, in the mid 2000s, but really before that, I was a grad student in reconciliation studies in Northern Ireland. And I was motivated to really understand and learn and figure out how to help make change in a world at the time that was, at least in America, that was the United States, that was embroiled in like the war on terror, right? I mean, we were still kind of reeling from 2000, from September 11th. And I found our response as a country so perplexing and, destabilizing and distressing, really, that, there was this traumatic event on our soil, and we decided as a nation to retaliate. And we had some sort of expectation that would stop terrorism, that would make people like us, that would, make peace. And it was just, I felt so deeply that we had really missed an opportunity to do something different. And so that's what motivated me to go into reconciliation studies, which is about how do you address conflict? How do you heal after conflict? How do you make change out of very difficult situations? And I was so hopeful that I would learn, and then I'd really be able to address some of kind of the wrong turns that I thought that we were making. But what I found was that as a field, right, we really weren't ready to do that. I mean, there were lots of impressive thinkers and a lot of really wonderful academic work that described conflict, that described how some conflicts ended, how some people healed. And what that produced were lists and recipes for what other conflict situations should do, but that didn't always fit. And I was left kind of always scratching my head and wondering, I mean, how does this work? What if there's a context over here where it doesn't work? There were often, in order to make peace after conflict, you need apology and reparation and this kind of list. And it just didn't sit right for me, because it was as though we were meant to squeeze conflicts into boxes in order to resolve them or change them and make peace, but it didn't work, and it doesn't work. And what we know is that solutions and progress really are best and most sustainable when they come from the context at hand, when those solutions kind of emerge from the people who are in that situation to begin with. So not necessarily a pre-formed solution, but an emergent one, an elicitive one that really addresses what's going on for the people who are involved. And so what I felt like was lacking, like the gap in the field, what was needed in the field, and really what the insight approach is working towards, was a method, right? A way to discover the unique elements that contribute to a conflict or a challenge or a broken system that's, making life difficult for people, or even a system that works, right? Why does that solution work? How can we understand it? How can we explain it? So what the insight approach is, what it does, is give us a framework to discover those elements that are unique to a conflict or a challenge or a given situation. And it's one that can be regularly applied, right? So it's a method, it's a framework for discovering what is it that is leading to a particular situation. And it's really anchored in, it's not just what are those, how can we describe it, but what's animating it, what's driving it. And in order to get at that information, ultimately, is we need to do, and what the insight approach is anchored in, is this idea that our actions, our systems, our cultures, our habits, our history really is created by the decisions we make and the decisions we make together. Okay, so the insight approach helps show us how to pay explicit attention to how we're making decisions, and what we're doing when we're making decisions that lead to conflict or lead to change or lead to systems that might be working, that might be broken. But really with this idea that we can discover those unique elements by paying attention to what we're doing with our minds when we're making decisions to act together, to create. And it's really not easy. So there's this focus on what are we doing with our minds when we're making decisions. And this is not easy at all, because we're used to making decisions all the time. You're making one right now just by sitting here and listening, or by checking your phone, or by doing whatever. I'm making one by talking. So we're always making decisions, and we don't necessarily pay attention to them very often. It's like walking. We're just used to doing it. So we do it, but we're not attentive to how our knees bend and where we put our heel and all those elements. We're more focused on what's in front of us, what's external, right? More than how our thinking and feeling, impact our responses, how we're really using our minds to act in the world. So the insight approach, the way that I understand it, is a method for discovering how are we making decisions that contribute to particular situations. And that's what it is in terms of a method. And what's fascinating about the insight approach as method is that it also gives us tools, right? Because if we know what to ask, if we know where to focus our attention on that decision making, on the interiority of that decision making, how we come to know, how we discern significance, how we how we respond, then we can create tools and skills for responding in context specific ways. So we have the insight approach as method, and we have this variety of tools and applications that are derived from it, depending on our role, depending on our goals. What are we trying to achieve within our particular context? And the tools themselves can then look very, very, maybe not very different, but can look different, can take on a different sheen. But the method and what we're trying to understand, which are those unique elements, that decision making that animates contexts, that's the kind of the glue or the thread, right, that binds us all together. So yeah, so that's what the insight, I would say, in a broad way, the insight approach is. It's a method for discovery, and it's skills and tools to help us discover. And we're all applying them in different ways. In fact, I work with police and compliance and enforcement, Cheryl with mediators and interpersonal conflict, Viev with art. And I want to turn then to Cheryl, really, because there's so much more I can say. But we talked a lot yesterday when we all met about, and I think that I'm about how the insight approach is this theory, method, and practice. And you, as an early founder of the insight approach, were able to draw on your own practice and help develop the insight approach to explain that. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more from your perspective what the insight approach is and how you came to it through your experience and practice.
Sure. Thanks, Megan. I want to point out, as I listened to Megan, I wanted to point out to you that what Megan has just so ably put forward in terms of what the insight approach is, and that there is such a thing. Notice I want you to pay attention or notice imagine that we never had that question 20 years ago. We never asked questions about what are our minds doing when we're in conflict or trying to bring about change in the way that we've now got a very clear understanding about kind of what's going on in terms of the insight approach. What are the kinds of questions? What are the kinds of things that we want to do? I think that as I reflect back on, for me, about 20 years of sort of in and out of trying to figure out what are people doing in conflict, and in particular, what am I doing as a mediator trying to help them with conflict? That's where I came from, that we have this very sophisticated, very clearly articulated, theoretically informed method, practice, way of bringing change into the world in very difficult conversations. And that alone has to be appealing for people that are coming into the field. In many ways, it's an evolution, or as a dear colleague of ours would say, a revolution that helps us to be better at being able to help people change circumstances that they're in for the better. So as we're talking, and as Viev talks about it in terms of theater and the arts, imagine that there wasn't this conversation happening that long ago. And it's a testament not only to the people who've been involved in the development of this, it is a testament to the solidness of a theoretically informed way of engaging in the world that is progressive. It is one that we can learn and we can repeat and we can share with others. My background, as Megan said, is in conflict work, in conflict studies, and in particular in mediation, where I was at about 20 years ago, well, probably even more than that, people in this field of conflict resolution and mediation were asking the question, are we doing what we think we're doing? It was the first time we kind of wondered whether what was happening was a good thing and we were actually achieving it. And so it started this conversation among largely academic practitioners about what is the theory, what are we using, what do we believe about conflict, and is it what we want to continue to do? As somebody who was very actively involved, I couldn't answer the question, what am I doing when I'm mediating? I didn't know consciously didn't know what my theories and beliefs about human nature and social action were all about. And so I collaborated with a colleague and dear friend of mine, Ken Melchin. Many of you would have heard his name if you're reading any of the materials. And I said, I need some help to figure this stuff out. Are you willing to help? And the answer I got from Ken was, well, of course, I'll be happy to help you. And I know exactly what you're doing when you're doing mediation. You're trying to get insights. And that seemed such an obvious response that I said, sure, okay. But it didn't understand what that meant. And it was with his work helping to first help us look at what was happening in mediation, not so much what I was doing, but how people were responding. The parties in the mediation session were responding to what I was doing. How the parties in the mediation session were responding to what each other was doing. So it wasn't so much that we were particularly interested in the minute details of the skills, but the reactions, the responses. What are people responding to? And that really comes from an interpretive theory of social action, that people are responding, trying to make sense of their environment. And so as we moved forward, taking ideas from Bernard Lonergan, where most of Ken's academic work has really been located. He's a Lonergan scholar, a very esteemed Lonergan scholar. And we took his theories of learning and tried to make sense of what are people learning when they're in a mediation session? How are they learning it? What are the kinds of things that we could help them learn maybe better, so they could understand what's going on for themselves and for others, and open the channels of communication, or become more curious about what others are doing, or even why did I respond that way? What is this about for me? What am I feeling? What am I valuing? What's going on? And so that's where, in terms of insight, that's why we called it insight mediation. We needed academically to talk with others, academics and scholars, who were doing narrative mediation, transformative mediation, evaluative mediation, all kinds of forms of now labeled mediation practice was coming out, and we needed to be able to simply label it, and it made sense to call it insight mediation because of its deep roots in Lonergan's theories of learning and the power of insights. And so we started with a practice, make sense of it theoretically. We made sense of the theory of the practice, and then went back to change the practice and hone the practice a little bit more. I'm talking here of insight mediation. So it was more reflective of what we now understood was the theory behind it. And that sort of practice to theory, theory to practice, practice to theory, all that evolutionary methodology of trying to understand what's going on continues to this day as we talk with you and as you learn what we have come to understand about how to bring about change to conflict, how to bring about change in situations that need change to happen. So what I will close with, in terms of saying what is the insight approach and why does it matter and why should you learn about it, is that I think it is to date the most theoretically informed practice that explains what is going on within ourselves and with others, whether that be in conflict or in social interactions that we're trying to make sense of. It explains what it offers us an explanation that we can repeat as we move forward and try to improve our circumstances, whatever they may be. So let me stop at that point. And Viev, so, insight in theater, how did it get to that point that you were able to take the ideas that started with mediation and then in conflict and learning, and say, how do we bring those ideas of insight and learning into theater?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Cheryl. The most, I was going to say elegant answer, although I don't know if it's very elegant. It's the answer that is very much, though, at the fore for me of that question, which is because everything that you and Megan have just talked about is intrinsically dramatic. It's intrinsically dramatic to think about being a person in this world, walking around in these bodies, interacting with others, and making meaning of that. And especially when you're being out there in the world and someone else's being come into some kind of, whether it's a clash, so that it's a conflict, or even if it's harmonious, what is happening there? What is going on? And so if the insight approach is, which it totally is, a way of explaining and understanding how it is that we are coming to know, value, and decide, right? So if it's us making decisions, that process of wondering about that is intrinsically dramatic, and it's drama. So that's how that for me, it was so animating, to use Megan's word. It was so illuminating. It was so exciting, because the thing that you could do is not just hope that you make good theater, not just that you endeavor and think, hopefully we'll capture something, but it was like, oh, there's a method by which we can actually methodologically wonder about ourselves and others in a way that we can ensure that we get the drama, really. And the thing that I was really thinking about, and I'm going to throw out some terms that we use in the insight approach, and whether these are familiar to some of you, all of you, or not, it's I think it's okay, because they explain themselves in a sense. The thing that happens that's empirically understandable is if you pay attention to the way that you're making meaning, if you pay attention to what your mind is doing, there's a pattern. So in the insight approach, people call it sort of the pattern of consciousness. And in this pattern of consciousness, we are experiencing things, and then we are seeking to understand what it is that we just experienced, whether it's in the realm of the data of sense or in the data of consciousness, right? So the thinking, the feeling, or the thing that comes at us, literally, the bike down the street. But we spontaneously want to know. We want to understand. And oftentimes we do all of this very, very quickly. We do it habitually. Thank God, if it's in the case of the bike, we hop out of the way. Woo, we don't need to think about that too much. But when we are really being introspective, when we're interested in our own interiority, to take that moment and say, okay, I came to that conclusion, I came to that understanding very quickly. Was I being particularly curious about what I just experienced, or pretty incurious? And then the pattern continues. We then seek verification. Is it so? Is it really so that I understand this correctly? Is it so that I think it is what I just decided it was, right? And so that way too, it's like, am I being critical? Am I being hasty? Again, these aren't even, they don't necessarily take on a normative, like one is better than the other. But if you are trying to sort of pay attention to the ways that you're making meaning, it can be very helpful to have these categories, to have these in mind, so that you can get very discerning about your own meaning making. And then the big question is the so what question, the valuing question. This is where so much of it lies. Then this is where the drama is, I think, which is like, oftentimes we're very elemental in our valuing. It's like, I'm totally pissed. Okay, that's dramatic. That's great. That's good. And yet it only gets us so far. The next question is like, what is it that is so ratifying? What is it that's making you so this, right? And if we really get into wondering about the gaps that open up when we're feeling frustrated, but the gaps that open up when we're feeling pissed, furious, all the things, or even the fits that are happening when we're feeling elated, or when we're feeling, woo, that felt so good. Oh, what was it that felt so good? I don't know, it just felt so good. Oh, great. And, it's fun to get discerning about our valuing. It's fun to think about what is it that you were hoping, you really want to show up in the world particular way, and you are not. And there is a big gap happening right there. That big gap, full of stuff, drama, full of interest, and also informative. It's just so informative. So when we find ourselves making these decisions, one after another, quite habitually, and we find ourselves in conflict, and we wonder what in the world is happening. The insight approach is the method that allows us to ask the kinds of questions of ourselves and others that shine light, illuminate what is actually happening. Oh, I don't know what's happening. Actually, you do. We can figure it out. We can figure it out together. We can absolutely do that. And for my work with artists, the two are really both the two things in terms of being interested in your own interiority and wondering, like, what is it that is so vexing, or what is that gap that's opening up, or how come was I really imaginative in thinking about all the options, or was I just habitually making these decisions, not really generating very many imaginative options? So A, that, and then B, wondering about others. And especially when we're making theater, the ability to say about either another person or even a character you're creating, let's ask these sets of questions. Let's wonder about someone in their own terms. Let's get really curious about their meaning making. So I got a little excited and started to go way far afield, I think. But that for me, so the Insight approach has been revolutionary. And the only other thing I want to mention, Megan, you made me really think of when you said that it was the war on terror that you responded so animatedly to, and said, I've got to go into not conflict studies, but reconciliation and wonder, what's working? Well, maybe nothing particularly well. The thing that ignited my interest in using Insight with theater was when I got back from the Peace Corps and I got back to New York City. New York City had changed because of the war on terror, because of what had happened, and because of the see something, say something, and the way that people were suspicious of one another, the way that people were treating one another, the way that all this being brown was no longer okay at all. I mean, being Black has never been okay in this country. Being brown was all of a sudden a whole nother thing. Wearing a hijab was a threat. And I was despondent, and then I got so curious, like, what's happening here? And so we did a piece about being Muslim and non-Muslim post 9/11, using the Insight approach to do exactly what we were talking about, to get super duper curious about the decisions we were making, the actions that people were taking. And was it really so that we had to keep doing that?
So I'd like to jump in just for a minute and wonder, Jamie, whether you want to make a couple of comments. You're one of the early people in the Insight method and helping to formulate that for us so we could use it. And maybe you want to say a few things about that before we open it up.
I think you're on mute, Jamie.
Thanks, Cheryl. I don't know that it's true. I've been thinking about the Insight approach, and I was introduced to it by you and by Ken, and I learned enormously from you, and I've learned enormously from Megan and from Viev. And my focus has been on trying to pin down the science of it, trying to pin down what the method is, what we're actually doing, and how that works, and how that can be applied. But I'm really interested in what other people are wondering about more than I am in talking. So I'd rather decline that kind invitation than acknowledgement of me, which I'm grateful for, and just see what's going on for the folks who are here wondering what the Insight approach is and why. So respectfully, thank you.
And can I say one more thing, because of Viev? So one thing, what you were talking about, what came up for me is that, there is so much drama in the decisions we make, in, what goes into that. And the way that you're able to bring the Insight approach and the method of discovery, that are those questions that help us get curious in a particular way, that elicit, the knowing, the valuing, the deciding of any situation, really brings to the art that you and other Insight artists create, this authenticity that is so incredibly moving. I mean, it blows us. It's amazing, because you're able to tap into that. It isn't kind of throwing spaghetti against the wall, I hope this works. It's telling these very human stories that are actually derived from the humans themselves, right? They're not what I think or what I assume, right? It's not that we have an explanation that we're transposing on other people. It's how are we discovering what's actually going on for them or within ourselves that can create authentic art, that can help us understand what needs to happen to create change, that can bring parties together to imagine, as you put it so well, Cheryl, that can open possibilities for new ways of interaction, for new ways of interacting that it might have been unimaginable before, right? We're really opening up these worlds with this. When you think about it, and when you get into the insight approach, it seems it's actually quite simple. We're getting curious, we're asking questions. Our orientation is towards discovery rather than solutions beforehand. So that's where I went listening to your piece, which
Yeah. And one thing I would say about the discovery piece is, so we do insight conversations, which is really fully informed by insight mediation. How do you ask a good insight question, right? And so an insight conversation is just a way of having a conversation that you're not hypothesizing, you're not bringing as much as you possibly can, right? But that it's not a friend conversation where oh yeah, that happened to me too, right? There's just a real deep continued curiosity, just like this exquisite curiosity about the person that you're talking to. And the thing that has floored me every single time, now we've done hundreds of insight conversations for all the different pieces we've done, is that I am always surprised. I am always surprised. I could never anticipate. I mean, maybe some of the things around the edges, but when you really start to ask about the value and you really start to get into the gaps and what was worrying and what the care to threat, to use Cheryl's, I am always, always, always like, I never would have been able to hypothesize that ever. And I think that is one of the, so again, being on this journey of discovery, if you really are on it, whoo, you can get, just blown away.
I see that Alma has her hand up.
Thank you. I first want to say I'm excited to see Jamie. You won't remember.
Yes. Oh, yes, I do, Alma. Yes, I do. Very well. It was great to have you in class.
My favorite teachers, and the books you assigned us never gave them away. I did my doctoral work post 9/11. I didn't look at 9/11, but I interviewed about 50 practitioners, mediators, came to New York. So very happy to hear of your efforts, Viev. Did I pronounce it correctly? And I did a qualitative study. And one of the things that was very clear to me is how do I get to the question with folks that I was interviewing. I went to CUNY, a broad range of subjects. And the biggest challenge was if you ask a question around cognition and affect, it was very difficult for people when you do qualitative research. Sometimes you ask what they're thinking, they answer what they're feeling. Sometimes you ask what they're feeling, they respond about what they're thinking. And so I learned quite a bit about how it is important to ask the question of what is important for you and to you as you are engaging. And I must admit that even the top practitioners had a lot of trouble, not because they should not have any issues, but just trying to reflect on their practice and how they created meaning was not an easy journey for many of them, nor was it difficult to report on it. They also were not immune. This is about 15 years ago, probably a lot has changed, as you mentioned. They also weren't immune to their own stereotypes of others. So I'm looking at all of us, and we have a lot of people off screen, so we don't know who's present. But the competing worldviews that people bring, and also their life experiences based on their identity, I think are very difficult to unpack. So I'd be interested, sorry, it's a long way to get to the question, but I'll be interested in how the insider mediation, well, especially post 9/11 and what this country is going through in terms of racial discourse and globally. I see somebody from India. I'm, like I said, Palestinian American. What do we do with that? How does that play in? Thank you for the time.
Cheryl, did you want to respond as from the mediation standpoint?
Sure. I don't know that I'm going to respond quite directly. I think you're asking a very, very complex and important question about how does culture and identity impact on the work that we do in conflict. So how I want to answer that question for you is that in insight mediation, we are very clear about the definition that we follow in terms of what conflict is. And we talk about conflict as a response rather than an intention, as a response to the experience of threat, to the things that deeply matter to us. So that's what's going on in terms of the conflicts that we're dealing with. And that's different from what was commonly used in conflict resolution work, which was incompatible goals, competing interests, those kinds of things. So the fact that we define conflict so differently influences greatly what it is that we ask about. It's not so much how we ask the question. It's not the nature of the question, although that it matters more that it's open than closed, for instance, but that we are asking about the perceptions of threat, the reality of threat, because the conflict behavior is a response to that experience of threat and how people feel they have to defend against that threat because they care about it. They care deeply about it. So what we're our intentions in the mediation process is to discover what is the threat that's causing the defend behavior. We know that the pattern of defend behavior cannot continue if people are going to be able to learn from each other, if they're going to have curiosity about each other, if they're going to ask questions about how they can make different decisions, that they have to stop the pattern of defend behavior. And so that is, those are the major features of what we're trying to do in the mediation center. Open the possibility of learning by changing the conflict behaviors. And that happens by asking about the threats to discover whether it's necessarily so that those threats that people are experiencing have to exist in that relationship, have to be part of their relations. And often they're part of the relation because they don't have the full set of knowledge about what's going on. They have their interpretation of what's going on, but they don't have the full set of everybody's interpretation to help make sense of the circumstance they're in differently. And if we can make sense of things that don't make sense, or we can make sense of things differently that aren't so threatening, then we can engage in conversations that allow us to be able to make the decisions for ourselves in terms of what's best for us now. So maybe a long way through the answer to your question, but I hope that's helpful, Alma.
And I think something that and I don't want to take too much time, but I think something else to highlight that you're highlighting, Cheryl, is that by asking about threat, right? That's asking about valuing. That's asking about what's motivating that decision to respond, the decision to the decision to defend, that conflict behavior. What's perpetuating the conflict dynamic? You're asking about the interiority, right? And so that's that helps to take the mediator out of it. You're not out of it, but at more of a facilitator, a person who's helping to cultivate curiosity, facilitate learning, open up the space. Whereas what I was hearing you say is that it's hard to be reflective as a practitioner, partly because it's hard to often conflict practitioners and in other areas too, it's more intuitive. We're kind of following our nose, going with what works, but the insight approach with that definition helps to direct our curiosity, right? Where are we looking? What do we need to unpack? And by doing that, it also relieves the mediator of having to come up with a solution or quickly interpret what's going on in order to package something up and hand it to the parties. Instead, it all comes from, as you said, Cheryl, from what's driving the conflict to begin with, those elements that makes the context unique, that's surprising, that always will surprise, as Yev mentioned. So I think that's how the insight approach in this, with its focus on discovery, really does help us get out of the traps that we can fall into when we don't know, when we're not going for the interiority, and when we don't really know what we're doing when we're doing it. Catherine?
Hi, thank you. So I see the power behind the insight approach, certainly. My background is also in reconciliation, and I work very closely with Indigenous groups in Canada and elders. And so this approach sounds very similar to how you would run a sharing circle, which we commonly use. Where I'm interested in hearing more about how these techniques work is I'm working on bringing together a group of Indigenous people and a group of compliance officers. And over the last 2 years, we have gradually gotten to a place where no one feels safe talking to anyone anymore at all. And on the one side, I have a group of Indigenous people who are open and prepared to have these conversations. And on the other side, I have a group of wonderful but rigid, I'm going to call it what it is, middle-aged white folks coming to terms with their white fragility. And it has been a toxic environment for about the last 4 months. So what I'm wondering is how to prepare the people who aren't ready for that self-reflection of why am I feeling threatened? What were the assumptions? How do you prepare them for the insight approach, and how do you get their buy-in? Thank you.
Shall I jump? So in some ways, I don't think you can prepare them, Kathleen. Well, here's what I was going to start with. In some ways, I want you to ask yourself, I wonder what that compliance group is defending. I wonder what they're defending from. I wonder where the threat lies. And they, as long as they feel they have to defend, and I suspect probably at the level of identity, right? They have certain things they have to follow. And so as long as they're defending before they even begin, then you're not going to be able to engage in a very open conversation. And I'm going to ask the same of the Indigenous group. I mean, they may be ready to share, but what happens when they share it? How are they sharing? And does that way of sharing cause the compliance members to feel they have to defend more? So the value of this particular approach is that you as the intervener are able to notice the pattern. So even though if people are sharing from the heart, which is wonderful, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they shouldn't, but you're more interested in what happens when they do that than whether they do that. How does that then impact the other group? And if it's going to up their defending, then that's not going to work no matter how sweetly you talk to everybody and try to use the skills. You have to change the pattern. The pattern has to change. And so some of it, and this is a long conversation, which in some ways I'd be happy to, have it another time with you, but there is some preparation work. There is some things that you can work with both groups to say, let's understand why you can't have this conversation together yet, and how you have to change what you're doing, because it matters to you to have the conversation. It matters to get this done. So my job is going to help get it done, but you can't talk in the way you've been talking. Helpful?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
if I may, just to add one thing to what Cheryl is saying, what all of you have been saying really, is the thing that's interesting and very difficult about the insight approach, and it's been illustrated here, is that the only way change is going to happen is if the people who are engaged in conflict behavior change their minds. Change the pattern is the way Cheryl was talking about it, and that's absolutely right. The pattern of defending, but the way you change a pattern of defending is become aware that you're doing it, to become aware of how you're using your mind to defend, and then shifting away from that. And what we've discovered, what mediation does, what Viev's theater does, what Megan's work with police officers does, is by asking the kinds of questions, or having the kinds of conversations, or having the sorts of art performances that enables people to get curious about how they're using their minds when they're engaging in conflict behavior. And when they discover that they're not using them very well, or they're using them in counterproductive ways, or they're using them in ways that have blind spots, that's what used to be called the magic of mediation. It begins to shift, where people discover who they are, or what they're doing in the process, how that pattern is the way they're acting, and the consequences it's having, and people will change their minds. And if they don't, there's still no other way to do it. The only way that, I mean, you can't, you can try to buy people off, right? You can try to coerce people. Even the word compliance is difficult, because if they're compliance officers, they're used to a theory of change which says, live by these rules or else. And the theory of change baked into compliance is kind of a coercive one, typically. And so you're trying to work with two different theories of change, and the insight approach will help you, as Cheryl was saying, will help you navigate those, because it will help you figure out how people are acting, how they're using their minds, and give you strategies for heightening their awareness of that.
Mhm. Yeah, very nice. Are there any other thoughts or wonderings about, what is the insight approach, or how would you use it? What makes it different from the rest of the participants?
Karen, here, I put a question in the chat, and my background is mediation. And I mean, my curiosity goes to this, even a demo in terms of how you use it, like a scenario, a short one you can walk through. Because for me, I'm trying to distinguish and unpack how my process is working, and that ability to kind of compare it to how you're using it in the tools. I would find that helpful.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good
Okay.
suggestion.
Yeah. Well, so I think we can do some sort of a demo or share some of the questions. And I think that as you do compare, another piece to just highlight is that you may find that this is what you're doing already, and that that insight has an explanation for why it works, or for perhaps where it might not. So that's another kind of feature of the insight approach, that you can say, wow, oh, that's why my mediations are working out so well. And I think that's what, Cheryl found in her own practice. Why is this working so well for me? It's because of what she was going for in terms of the threat. Yeah. So for Cheryl, I'm not sure if you want to share, since Karen's a mediator, kind of what questions you might ask, or what skills you might use. I could share some from my area, and I'm sure Viev could share some from hers, but what do you think?
Sure, I would be happy to. It's an excellent question, and again, one that really requires more time, Karen, than we have. So the piece I would like to give you is that I don't know how you've been trained as a mediator, what model you're following. I do know that it's a common practice for non-insight mediators to ask parties what about the problem, about the issues, what's been going on, as a way to get started into some kind of a dialogue. And so a major difference right from the get-go is we would not ask about any of those things. And we don't ask about any of those things because if you ask about the problem or the issues or what's been going on and what have you been doing to deal with all of this, how people respond to that question is to give you a defending response, to explain what they're doing, which actually is what we call a defense story that causes the other party in hearing that to disagree. That's not what the problem is, or that's not what's going on. So they start defending. So as I told you before, we're changing the pattern of defending. And so we actually start with, asking about, let's talk about what are the worries that people have if this continue. What's the worry? What's the worst that's going to happen here? What are you most worried will happen, or that you're trying to protect against from happening? What's the dire outcome here? We actually ask questions about what people, what we call a threat to a care. So the threat, what's the threat? What's the worry? What's going to happen that's so horrible that you have ended up finding yourself in this kind of a conflict situation? And that in the answer to the question, we often start to get a sense of what are some of the things that matter to them. What are some of their cares? So we really go down a different narrative than would traditionally have been the pathway that mediators would have gone down. Okay, because we're not trying to solve the problem. We're trying to open up communication so people can find a way to make different decisions.
And
Beginning,
Upasana
not
asks-
in, yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. Can we do that in a joint session or only a private session?
Oh gosh, it's a joint session. It's a joint session because, in fact, insight mediation, unless there's reasons like violence, or we need to add extra protection, everything is done in a joint session because it's the only way that people are going to hear when they have misinterpreted what people are doing or what this is about, or when they start to hear the underlying cares that people have that actually they probably share, that reside at the level of identity and at the level of roles and relationships. So that has to happen in a joint session.
Mhm. Okay,
Yeah,
do you have some more, Upasana?
Yes. Can I just ask one follow-up question on that, Cheryl? Yeah. So in a joint session, if I ask the party about their fears or what are they worried about, or if I open with that, in my experience, and I know that is very limited, but they might not open up. They might feel that I'm with the other party, I'm trying to corner them, or if they open up with their fear, so their case is already on the negotiation table, they are on a weaker spot already.
So it's not an if question, it's a how question. How do I do it in a way that people don't feel that way, don't end up, feeling trapped, or that they're not safe in terms of that. So there's a whole lot, you have to recognize I'm giving you answers to questions that take some deeper understanding so you can do it well. But what I am saying that's very clear is we don't go down the positions that people or the issues that people have or the problems that people have, because we're actually going to escalate that situation more. So I understand what you're saying. It's not an if question, if we do that, but how do we do it in a way that that's not what happens?
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, the other thing, if I can, I think it's helpful to say, we may not ask the question the best way, the right way for the parties, but we are well trained in this insight approach to notice how people receive that question, how people answer the question. And if we see that they're responding in a way that would be defined as defending behavior, then that's not a very good question. We have to do something different. We have to go at it another
Right.
way. Okay, but
Right.
we're very skilled at noticing people's responses to what we ask about or how we ask it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that.
That's very helpful, as Karen here is my thought process is really going to, it's how you set it up and set the stage around it, and it's kind of that opening and how you introduce it. I mean, I was trained in interest-based mediation. I've been moving away from that because I'm finding many times it's not helpful. You know,
Yeah.
it's not helping the parties and being very open to other ways of helping the parties, meeting them where they're at. And so for me, it's about learning more about the insight approach and that opening, that framing with the parties around what this is and what you're trying to accomplish and what you're looking from them, looking for from them.
Yeah, Karen, absolutely. And it's not so much that the tools are different, it's that the direction in which we take the conversation and the things that we're asking about that are quite different from other models. So good. Yeah.
Thank you.
And so there are actually, you know, I'm seeing that it's 6:02 of here. So I think it's time for us to wrap up, but, you know, we do go to our website, insightcollaborations.org, and we have more programming coming up. I think in May, in a couple of weeks, we have a really interesting event on, oh gosh, we have, what is it? It's it's Marnie Dull and Chuck Obasi talking about clashes of positions and encounters of
Hundreds of persons. Mhm.
Yeah, so I mean, that's going to be a really wonderful event. We have some learning series coming up too that that tap into insight mediation, to some of the basic language of the insight approach. So feel free to go online and take a look at what's coming up, because there's lots to learn and lots to discuss and lots to discover. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And if you have any other questions, you know, pop them in the chat or send them to us, and we would be happy to respond.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you all. This was a this was a good hour. This was a good hour.
I hope that we've expanded your interest and that you'll continue to learn and be part of the growing group that are learning and together. Thank you.